Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Sacred Anarchies, a post-church podcast. As always, I am here with my co-author, co-conspirator, partner in crime, Barry Taylor, but we have a very special treat for everyone today. We are honored and privileged to be having a conversation with Jack Caputo. Welcome, Jack. How are you?
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, Maria. Doing well,
Good.
as well as any pandemically confined person can do. I'm fine.
That's good. Yeah.
When you're retired, it's not quite as big a difference between pandemic and non-pandemic.
When you have an itinerant life, it's not that different from being retired either. Anyway, we're happy you're here.
We're so happy. I'm sure our listeners need no introduction in terms of your work and how prolific you've been in your career and your lifetime in terms of generating knowledge and ideas and publishing and writing and all of these things. And as I was preparing for this talk today, I just thought, oh my gosh, your life's work, so many things to be asking about, so many things to be wondering about, how to kind of pinpoint, over the next 30 or 40 minutes, what we really want to talk about in terms of what you've done and what's most helpful for our listeners to hear. I was hoping that maybe you'd start out by giving us, I don't know that I would ask for basic, but there's a lot of talk of, post-theism and a lot of Christians at a pop culture level who are using the term deconstruction as they're talking about the process they're going through in terms of disentangling and disentwining from harmful faith constructs and traditional theism and things like that. But radical theology is continuing to make its way very accessibly so to a pop culture level. If you had to define for our listeners today radical theology in, I don't know, a few sentences, something that you think would be most helpful, a really good working definition as people are maybe even approaching it for the first time, what would you say?
The easiest way to get at it is to distinguish it from what you could call confessional or denominational theology, where there is a fixed authority and authoritative sources and a canon and a more or less canonical tradition, all of which should be put in quotes, but you know what I mean. And then I think, well, so one way to think about radical theology is there wouldn't be any such thing as radical theology if it weren't for the confessional traditions. It wouldn't be a radical Jesus if nobody remembered Jesus. Nobody would have remembered Jesus if there wasn't some institutional formation, some community that gathered around him and preserved his memory and started to write it down and passed it along. And, that's what you mean by a tradition. So I always think of radicalization as the radicalization of something. You can't, there's no such thing as radical theology, which is not the radicalization of something.
Yeah,
sure.
It's the searching through and rethinking and probing for the sort of the sources of these traditions, of any tradition. Radical anything is looking for the sources of something. Now, what's not radical in the traditional sense of radical is when usually that's the search for a foundation. And radical thinking is foundational thinking in the ordinary sense of the word. But the way I use it, and I think the way most people use it nowadays when they talk about radical theology, is not the radical foundation, but a kind of radical non-foundationalism, a kind of the root is exposed and the root is fragile and the roots are not a firm foundation. So it's a radical rather than radical founding, it's radical exposing. Well, radical exposing of something that looks to be stable and well formed, the tradition, the confessional bodies, the canons, the creeds, the practices, the beliefs. But it is the instability within those seemingly stable formations that is interesting.
Yeah.
Because that's the possibility. That's why Heidegger says possibility is higher than actuality. It's this sort of inner impulse, or what Derrida would call the event, and Heidegger too would call the event, which is what you're getting at. And that destabilizes these seemingly stable formations and gives them, on the one hand, a future, but also a memory of something that I always like to say, a memory of the immemorial and a vision of the unforeseeable. So the destabilization is not destructive. The destabilization is reinventive and opening.
Yeah.
So you're not knocking anything down when somebody deconstructs you. You should thank them very much. You've just done you a favor, because they've opened you up to something that you were closing off, or had forgotten, or wouldn't let yourself imagine.
Yeah.
So deconstruction, it's not the best word for what he's talking about, what Derrida is talking about. It's got a great history, that word, by the way.
Yeah.
It comes from Heidegger's word destruction, which came from Luther. And I set that out in a couple of different books. And Luther was talking about the destruction of medieval scholastic theology in order to recover its evangelical sources, and sort of reinvent it. And it even goes back, and he uses the word in connection with First Corinthians 1, when Paul is citing Isaiah. So the word goes all the way back to the Hebrew, in which Paul says, quotes Isaiah saying, "I will destroy the wisdom of the wise in order to show you the wisdom of God." So it's a wonderful word, and it means to release inner impulses, or an event, or a possibility that has hitherto been sedimented or closed down. So radical theology is that. And my joke is, you could tell you hit radical theology when you get fired, right? So it's I mean, when you look around for it, more often than not, you'll find it among confessional theologians who have just gotten into a lot of trouble because they hit, I think, radical soil. They kept digging, and they hit radical soil, and they got in trouble because they could see it. And that's why pastors will sometimes say, "I can't do this anymore. I can't say this anymore. I don't, I understand the contingency of this formation, of this formulation, and I can't say this anymore. I can't tell people that anymore. I can't preach it anymore. And the people going to church are having the same thought. I can't listen to this anymore."
The interesting thing is that I think you really, that last statement, I can't speak about this anymore and I can't listen to this anymore, is very key to what's happening with a lot of evangelicals and conservative, or former evangelical and conservative sort of Christians today. The challenge for many of them is, it seems to me anyway, that that very interesting relationship between radical theology and confessional theology sometimes seems to be a little bit of a stumbling block because of that innate sense in a lot of modern Christianity, I'll say, the fear of not being orthodox. That even when people are abandoning what they can no longer hold on to, they still seem to have that hesitancy to make the liberating move. I don't know what you think about that, or if you think that.
That's and you see it in either the Catholic version or in Christianity anyway, in either the Catholic version or the Protestant version. Fear of offending the Pope, or fear of straying from the Bible. So you get biblical inerrancy and papal infallibility, which are sibling symptoms of this anxiety.
Yeah.
But you see it in Islam, and this is literalism of Islam. You see it wherever. You see it. I mean, almost anywhere. I mean, it happens in completely secular sources over the interpretation of the law or the constitutions.
Yeah.
There's a fear of. I mean, it's a fear of uncertainty. You know, it's what you need what Keats calls a negative capability. You know, the ability to sustain an uncertainty.
Yeah.
And that's what the radical and radical theology does. You know, it's not foundational. It exposes the contingency of what we think. But when you expose the contingency of what you think, it doesn't mean you should toss it. You know, it doesn't, because for one thing, you don't have any other alternatives. Whatever else you come up with will also be contingent. But some things are you know, everything's an interpretation, but some interpretations are better than others. Some things really have resources and they have depth, and but they only have depth, it seems to me, when you recognize their fragility and their uncertainty and their rethinkability. Because then, if the thing is not fixed, then it's up to you to fix it. You know, it's up to you to you're responsible for the interpretations you make. We have to assume responsibility for we say this is what the book says, or this is what the justice means. We're responsible for that interpretation, and it's you could be wrong.
Yeah. Are you familiar with kind of the current pop culture conversation and what is being called deconstruction? A lot of more conservative Christians and evangelicals who are leaving the fold are calling their process deconstruction. Have you engaged with this pop conversation at all, or have you kind of seen it, or have you watched it from the sidelines at all? And if you have, what are some of your thoughts on it?
I mean, I see the word pop up, and when I do, I pay attention to see. Sometimes it's being used poorly. It's just it's being used to knock something, meaning that we'll criticize or knock down, or it's a negative operation.
Yeah.
Sometimes I see it being used properly, where it means reinvention. As I said, so no, I'm not too sure I do keep up with what you're referring to. I don't follow a lot of podcasts, and I don't get on Twitter. And is that where it is?
Smart man.
Is that where it is? Is that where?
Yeah, I mean, it's happening a lot of places. It's gotten so much traction, I think, over the last year or so. It's just absolutely gone viral. And now it's, are you a Christian who has deconstructed? Are you a deconstructing Christian? Are you in the process of deconstruction?
Yeah, and it's also generated its own, the counter move amongst conserving conservatives who are now
want to tell people how to deconstruct because they know they're losing people in drugs, as they always,
But their deconstruction is actually a re-embrace of the same ideology. It's an interesting conversation. I think in some ways it's an extension of some of those earlier emerging church questioning, but written essentially in a globalized digital world for a start, which changes the nature of the conversation.
A new generation asks these questions, they take the conversation a little bit further.
Yeah, it's an interesting.
I must say, the first time when I wrote "What Would Jesus Deconstruct," it was based on a talk that I gave when I was invited to a emerging church thing that Brian McLaren had invited me to years ago.
Yeah.
So, and I gave this paper. The paper was called "Why the Church Deserves Deconstruction," meaning deserves in both. It's getting its comeuppance, but in the sense also that it's worth it. That there's something going on in the church that is worth the deconstruction, the unearthing.
Yeah.
And then I wrote the book, "What Would Jesus Deconstruct?" It hit me later after I gave the talk. What would Jesus deconstruct? That was the title in need of a book, right?
Yeah.
And, but it was emerging church, in an emerging church context that I first used it as perfect word for a religious tradition.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's perfect operation for a religious tradition. It's connotation is negative. Derrida didn't set out to call this thing deconstruction. The word just caught on.
Mm-hmm.
And then he just started using it. I mean, I don't know what he would have called it if by the end of his life, if you look back on the whole corpus, I would say the best thing to call it is a theory of the event or a philosophy of the event.
Mm.
Event philosophy. If it was German, you would say Eigensphilosophie.
Yeah. But then it would only be read in Heidelberg, you know.
Yeah. But the word deconstruction itself is, you know, it's as long as you appreciate that it's got this this deeper affirmation. It's a good word. I'm glad to hear what you're saying. I didn't quite know that. I mean, I see it appearing here and there.
Yeah. And it's being interchanged with the idea of also decolonizing Christianity and decolonizing religion. So they're two different words, deconstruction and decolonization.
There's a lot going on
but there's
underneath
a lot
it.
happening where those terms are being interchanged and used together. So it's a really interesting conversation to watch, to be a part of, to critique, to engage, you know, all of those things.
Jacques would be very happy to hear that.
Yeah, we're trying to put
we're happy to hear that. So another question for you. So when I first started learning about radical theology and post-theism several years ago now, I was in the perfect place and time in my life to sort of really engage these concepts. And they were so welcome. It was just perfect for me. And I've kind of lived in that camp and continued to study and grow there ever since. I find that radical theology and post-theism has so much hope for a proper future of faith, the kind of future of faith that religion always dreamed of, but couldn't quite, you know, cut it. And so, you know, when I think about the potentiality for something like radical theology, you know, above and beyond the boring conversation that's happening between theism and atheism, it's very exciting. And I just feel like if more people were exposed, it could just have so much promise and change so much. And I wanted to ask you, so Thomas Altizer, I think it was the late 90s, he did an interview. And in this interview, he was a bit down and a bit disappointed at the trajectory the work had taken since the beginning of the Death of God movement in the 60s with that infamous Time magazine cover. And it seemed to me in this interview, he had hoped for, you know, the last almost half a century that, you know, the popular and Western understanding of Christianity would have changed from the inside out. And it didn't quite, I don't think, pen out exactly how he had hoped. And, you know, when I think about your work and all that you've done over your amazing career, I mean, you know, to be where you're at now in life, like, and you look over your career and everything you've done, you know, has it met your expectations? What did you think when you first started out in this field? Did you have hopes and dreams, or were you just going to see where it went? And, you know, what do you think of the future for this kind of thought and this work?
Well, I didn't, first of all, I didn't set out to work in, when we were interviewing people for jobs when I was still, before I retired, we used to ask them what their research program was, you know, and then we expected some sort of articulate answer. And I used to smile to myself and say, thank God I got hired in the days when they needed faculty. They were looking for faculty and jobs were easy to come by. And nobody ever asked me that, because I wouldn't have been able to say. I would have just said, well, you know, at that point, I would have said, I'm really interested in Heidegger, and I'm working on this stuff in Heidegger, and, you know, what's down the line, I don't know. And at that point in my life, I was sort of had it, you know, with religion and theology, because I had been in a religious life, and I came out and I discovered Heidegger, and for all of his faults and limitations and sort of heinous politics, and his odious anti-Semitism, for all that,
yeah,
he's a great philosopher. And he emancipated me, he liberated me from all that.
Mm.
And so if you look at the work I did in those days, you know, I was talking about transcendental phenomenology and the reduction and the epoche and, you know, the technical transcendental phenomenology. And I found myself, I kept I got to, when I read Radical Hermeneutics, which was sort of where I broke out and found my own voice. The book, I thought the book was finished at the end of chapter 7. And I was just sort of where I had sort of worked out what I thought, and I still think is the right relationship between Derrida and Heidegger. And I thought, well, the book's over. But the book kept saying, no, it's not. It was answering me back. And I was just, what is wrong with this book? Why isn't it finished? And what I realized was I didn't really go on to say what difference all that made. Okay, so if this is how Heidegger relates to Derrida and Derrida to Heidegger, so what? What are we going to do about that?
Yeah.
What's it mean? And so then I went on and I talked about religion. I talked about rationality, and particularly science, and I was really interested in Thomas Kuhn at that point. Ethics, because I was going to write a book called Against Ethics. And then the last chapter, which I simply called The Mystery of Being, openness to the mystery, another Heideggerian phrase, in which I found myself talking about what? Or religion. So it's like religion was sort of standing on the corner, with its arms crossed, waiting for me to come around again and show up and say, oh, there you are. I've been waiting for you. So I came back to it. I was trying to rid myself of it and trying to dig out of it, but I was ultimately digging deeper into it. And so I found myself right back where I started, only this time having passed through Heidegger and Derrida, and also on Levinas and Lyotard and Foucault and all of them. And then I started writing more about religion, not from any design, but because that's just where I was. And but to come back to your question, I find myself saying now, do I even want to use the word religion anymore? I mean, religion has made itself so unbelievable and so reactionary and so odious and so mean and violent.
Yeah.
That I'm not sure it can be saved or it's worth saving or whether I should even use the word anymore. So yeah, my feeling right now is that this country, the United States, is an empire in decline. It can't accomplish anything anymore. It's torn up by deeply hateful, antagonistic spirits. And religion has been complicit in that. It's fired it to a great extent. And so about religion and its future, I am not the least bit sanguine. I'm in despair about it. I think that what we're talking about, that radical theology and the way we talk about theology, could if people would listen, could make a difference. But
but you don't have much hope for the listening.
The other thing that I've just become more and more conscious of in the last 10 years or so is, I think that we people who study the humanities have not been paying sufficient attention to what's going on in this post-humanist thing. The whole world that is about to has already begun to explode. Post-humanist AI work. And the utter transformation of what we've called human up to now. I mean, things are. I think we are in the process of an extraordinary transformation that I'm not going to live to see. But I think that's. And then the question is, what will religion have to do with that? And I've tried to make some stabs at that. And But I think that's ultimately the challenge that what we call religion faces, and whether the openness of being, the mystery of being, the unforeseeable of the future, where will religion have a place in that, and does it have a place in that? And I think it will. It won't look anything like what we call religion, but I think it'll have to do with a more cosmic dimension. That's why I think panentheism is sort of an interesting, theologically, philosophically interesting, because it's ultimately the mystery of the cosmos. I try to read these people. I try to read not just the AI people, but people like Carlo Rovelli, who writes about contemporary physics. And it takes them about 3 pages before they start using the word mystery.
Of course, yeah.
And imagination, and incomprehensibility. I think that's where the future will be. The future that. But,
I was reading we're doing a class at the moment, and I was talking a little bit about the Milbank Zizek Monstrosity of Christ book, and the introduction that Creston Davis writes, where he talks about the kind of standoff between the rationalist and the fideist, and the kind of where they sort of don't even need each other anymore, because they just are in their own little echo chamber of conversation. And he makes the point that neither side is sort of willing to take the risk to find new language and new ways of conceptualizing and speaking about the very thing that you're naming. And I think, as you've said, the thing that I think is most interesting, or one of the more interesting things about radical theology, is its potential to talk about anything in the name of in the name of the event, if you like to use your currency. Is that there's nothing that you can't bring into conversation and dialogue, and in that sense it's I don't know if I should even use the word, but there's a missional dynamic, I think, to radical theology that is sort of unrealized in terms of how and in what ways, because I'm inclined to agree with you. I mean, I think the whole conversation about as generic and as naive as it might be, I'm spiritual but not religious, it's a sign of something big. And even the term spirituality is sort of running out of steam in the not quite as quickly as religion. It's sort of chasing its heels, and yet as you say, you read more and more people in diverse fields who actually are essentially doing what I would call theology. And they become really interesting conversation partners for what I think theology is meant to be about anyway, which is about what it means to be human and to live in the world.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's why I said one way, good way, when Maria first asked me about radical theology, I said, well, the easiest way to talk about it is differentiate it from confessional theology. But you don't have to. That's just one way to do it. You could just say, well, it's wherever you go and you start asking big questions and start digging deeply, wherever that is. It doesn't have to be professional religion. It could be art. It could be science. It could be politics. It could be anything, because it's, as Tillich said, he's kind of old-fashioned guy, but he's right. He says religion is the depth dimension of anything. Dig deep enough, and you'll hit this radical core or radical theology. One thing though, Barry, about the word spiritual, it's got the kinship with spectre, right? At least in English, anyway. It doesn't, etymologically is not related, but it does have the affinity with spectre, spectrality, Zoom meetings. This thing I quoted at the beginning. I think it was the beginning of the new introduction of Deconstruction in a nutshell, when Derrida Derrida was sort of a star, and he was invited to participate in a movie. I mean, it was a real artsy kind of Sundance sort of thing, and nobody ever saw it, but except other intellectuals. But it was a movie called Ghost Dance.
Oh,
Did you ever hear that one?
yeah.
Ghost Dance?
No, I don't think so. Oh, Ghost, yes, yeah.
It was a movie in which he plays himself.
Yeah.
And so he's being interviewed by this young French actress, and she says to him, "Do you believe in ghosts?" And he says, "Well," he says, "I think right now I'm becoming a ghost. You know, I'm here. We're being recorded. I'm becoming an image. I'm becoming a specter. And long after I'm dead, people will be able to sit here and see me and listen to me. I'm becoming a ghost." And he says,
Yeah.
"I think that with modern technology," this is 1980, he says that,
Yeah.
that we are that the future belongs to ghosts.
Yeah.
The future belongs to specters. The future belongs to the virtualization of the material. And he's sort of like predicting, you know, the worldwide spread of electronic communication systems,
Yeah.
the cloud, and the ghosts and the angels and the demons on the cloud. And so spirit has a relationship with specter.
Yeah.
From spirit to specter, from geist to ghost.
You know, that's interesting.
So there's that. Yeah, so that is
that's either a book or an essay waiting to be written. Yeah, I mean, he also he also say in that essay about knowledge that our ignorance of technology opened up that space for animism and magic and mystery, or was that Lyotard? I think it was Derrida in that essay on knowledge and reason, I think. Interesting. I don't know if you're familiar with that. Might have been Lyotard.
No, this could be one of the many things I've forgotten, but or it could be Lyotard.
Yeah.
Lyotard was a little more attentive to these things than he was.
Yeah, and it's actually one of the things that I always appreciated about Mark Taylor's work was his pursuit of the religion in the non-religious space. And I think he actually got there before a lot of people in a different way.
He did. I always said Mark is always 15 years ahead of me, you know.
Yeah.
In 15 years, I'll be saying what Mark said. Yeah, he's very avant-garde. He's the most avant-garde of all the theorists. The only problem I have is that he's so avant-garde that he's almost sort of stopped talking about religion. Religion is where you what is it? Where religion is where you don't find it, or religion is.
Yeah.
How's he put it?
Yeah, it's the most interesting where it's the least obvious.
Yeah. But he's going so far in that direction that he's almost stopped talking about it.
Yeah.
And whereas I still want to keep the language and the discourse of God going. It's because I think that's the way radicalization works. It is working with paleonyms, as Derrida says. It takes ancient words and re-indents them.
But it's almost like with Mark, the more he becomes interested in the discourse, the less you hear what you expect to hear about the discourse in terms of, you know, traditional words and language. You know, in his introduction to After God, he talks about how a lot of people around him think he's given up the study and the discourse and his theological interest, but he says, in fact, he's never been more interested in it.
Yeah.
You know, so, and that's just one of the many things I love about radical theology and post-theistic thought is that it really connects to the regenerative part of the human condition and what it means to be human, and to, be compelled and pulled to make things new, which is why I think it's such a great fit and such a great next step for people who really can't be within the bounds and the confines of traditional Christianity, traditional religion, traditional theism anymore, but they're not interested in being atheist or agnostic. They're very much interested in continuing on in the narrative of what it means to be human and engage faith, in any given, social location or locatedness on a historical spectrum where we kind of live and die, and sort of that's it. But with that being said, what do you think, and this will be the last thing we discuss, but what do you think radical theology has to say about a pandemic world? And how do you think radical theology will be shaped now by this pandemic world, and more than the pandemic world, everything the pandemic revealed about our world over the last year? Do you think it has things to say? Do you think the world has things to say to it? How do you see that relationship happening and that dialogue happening? What do you think it will generate?
Yeah, well, the one thing I think is going to happen, and this has nothing to do with radical theology, is I think we've discovered how well we can do things virtually, and that a lot of businesses and a lot of occupations are going to be transformed by the fact that this actually works pretty well. I mean, I think business travel and flights and conferences and office space and everything and everything goes along with that is going to be deeply affected by it. Mm-hmm. The thought that I've had is this thing that we've just been talking about with Derrida about spectralization, that it's given us a much more acute sense of how well we can function, how well we do function spectrally. Mm-hmm. But you want to know what?
Yeah. What do you? How do you think the last year or this global pandemic will affect the new and next developments for something like radical theology? And how do you think, radical theology can speak into this new world that we're now being, ushered into?
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, I think that one of the things that you see going on is the terrible selfishness of people who really just don't who maximize their own freedom over what we in the tradition call the common good, the well-being of others. Yeah. They really don't care about anybody other than themselves. Yeah. And the one of the recurring themes in carnal philosophy since particularly in the post-structuralist stage of it is this question of the other, the other person, the rest of the globe, other species, other forms of life, other cultures, other people, and Levinas was sort of the saint of all that, the patron saint of all that. Yeah. And what you see with these people who refuse to wear a mask and refuse to be, who are insulted because they're being told that they're going to have to get vaccinated if they expect to be admitted to a restaurant or back to college. It was last night on television. They interviewed some student at some college which was announcing that they were resuming on-campus classes, but you couldn't come back on campus if you weren't vaccinated. This would be in the fall. And this guy was saying he was opposed to being told that he has to get vaccinated. And I say, well, if you're not smart enough to know that you should be vaccinated, and you don't care about about other people enough to get vaccinated, then you don't belong in this campus. You don't belong on any campus. Yeah. You don't belong in college. We're continuing the admission process by refining the admission process by getting rid of you. Yeah. So the pandemic has brought out the worst in us. It's brought out the selfishness and the meanness, which is no sense of hospitality, no sense of the other, no sense of commonality, and and radical theology is in part a political theory of pluralism and of multiplicity and of openness and of others. I mean, the pandemic has exacerbated economic differences and racial differences and ethnic differences, and the people who are least able to get access to the vaccine just don't get access to it. And so it's brought out all the injustice in, particularly over here in the United States. You know, the cities are the least successful at vaccinating people. People in the suburbs are getting vaccinated. So it's exacerbated the injustice in this world.
Yeah.
Radical theology is all about hospitality and alterity and the other.
Yeah.
But you don't need radical theology to be told that, you know.
Yeah.
Indeed. Yeah.
I think we know that anyway.
Indeed. Yeah. You know, it's radical. The opposite of radical theology would obviously be being an object and kind of the big other and the interventionist God. And you know, I think for so long, Western Christianity has been caught up in the idea of the interventionist God and the big other being for you. That when something seems not for you or differing of your opinion or completely other, it's wrong. And it's very difficult to accept that, I think, for people who are within the realm of, you know, interventionist understanding of God. And so, you know, radical theology offers us the opposite of that. And so perhaps we'll pay attention a little bit more to theologies that are centered in radical hospitality and the other, and a decentralization of big other in favor for the actual human, communal, mutual otherness that we can actually see and be a part of. So
one person who has done something about this is Richard Carney. He has just written a book on touch.
Okay.
And he's just explored all of the impossibility of touch. We can't touch one another. We can't hug. You know, we can't embrace. And so now we're trying to live without touch. And
interesting.
That's not particularly necessarily a radical theology, but it is part of a phenomenology of human experience.
Yeah.
Zizek explored that a little bit in the very beginning of his first pandemic book that came out in April. Did you see Zizek's 2-part series on it was Pandemic, Panic, and what was the second one that came out?
Pandemic, Panic 2.
Yeah, Panic 1, Panic 2.
Panic, don't panic.
Yeah, but he explores, you know, the part where Jesus tells Mary Magdalene, "Touch me not," and kind of starts out in that sense. So that's very interesting.
Yeah,
like,
Jean-Luc Nancy, Noli Me Tangere.
Yeah, Jean-Luc Nancy.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Before we get off before we end, do send me a link to some of this conversation you're telling me about, where the word deconstruction has gotten into circulation among.
Be prepared for an onslaught of.
We'll send you that email.
You know, a selected.
A curated,
we will.
I'd be curious to see how that word's doing in this context, which it's talking about.
Yeah.
Because I mean, I do see it, but I don't think I'm plugged into what you're talking about there, which is not surprising to me.
Where I know obviously you're publishing all the time, but if people wanted to like interact with you, do you do social media platforms? Like, where could people follow you in real time if they wanted to, or do you not do that?
Well, people contact me on Facebook often, and most of the time they just email me, which is sort of primitive, early.
It's prehistoric technology, Jack.
Kind of low tech, but on Facebook people get in touch with me. But I don't do too much else like that. Whenever, like when you two invited me to do a thing like this, whenever anybody invites me to a thing like this, I do it. First of all, because I enjoy it. But secondly, to let people know, you know, I'm fine. Here I am. I'm not dead yet. I'm still working.
We love it.
I'm always glad to do stuff like this.
That's so great.
Well, this conversation has been so fabulous and just so enjoyable for us, and we're so excited to release it over the next few weeks. So thank you. Thank you
thanks,
so much.
Jack. Good to see you as always. Stay safe.
My pleasure. And good luck with your work.
Right.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.